candidates, and both parties have some good
Great,
candidates.
so great segue here. Okay,
Right.
so how do the parties reach across the aisle? Okay, so we talked about how, as a Republican, you would market to a Republican, a Democrat, a Republican. How do they go across the aisle? How do Republicans bring that conservative message of more, fiscal conservative? How do you get that across? How do we get the other people to go on the side? Because ultimately, that middle is those people who are the most likely to flip to the other side, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to get a Green New Deal person to go over to the Conservative Party, and you're not going to get a Trumper to go over to that side. That's not going to happen. That middle of the bell curve is where this is going to happen.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what do we do? How do you market better to the other party?
I say number one, we got to stop marketing to the bookends of everything,
Right.
and then so that's number one. And then number two, I say we need to trash political data and bring in consumer data. Like, pay attention to what the consumers are consuming, because that's what you're putting in. Whenever I post something on social media, you're not posting it to the political points, the political voters. You're posting it to consumers.
Give me an example of consumer data. Like, what are you talking about? You're talking about like CPI, consumer price index numbers. What kind of data are we talking about?
So, for instance, right, we're like, let's talk about Gen Zers, right? Gen Zers care a lot about, and we actually talked about this on another radio show, that they care a lot about what's happening in the world and feeling like they have a purpose and feeling impactful in the world, right?
Yeah.
So that's consumer data. Politicians won't know that. They're not going to know that. Right? They're going to look at, well, what they're clicking on is, mental health issues. So we need to talk about mental health.
But it's a great point.
But
because if you look at like shoe companies, modern shoe companies, they're all putting sustainability and all those things.
Yes.
That's consumer data.
Yes.
If you paid attention to those little
Yes.
trends, you could probably craft a good political message.
Right.
And you're also ceding some power to the corporate machine by not talking about that.
Right. So we're going to talk about, like, for instance, so if with Kelvin and I, we're going to be putting out short videos and things, but one of the things we're going to eventually talk about is equality versus equity, but how it's sustainable. Which is the sustainable option. Because if you're all about really sustaining America, then why don't you hear what's the sustainable option when it comes to working with people in minority groups, and how do we close the wealth gap and all that stuff? We gotta teach it, and we gotta speak the language of the consumer and not the politician.